As life grows, as life thrives and becomes more complex, so too does the life of the individual seem to follow a kind of parallel course. For instance, to get us going, science, just in an ordinary sense, seems to grow increasingly specialized, as do all of the intellectual areas. You surely shouldn't need any absolute evidence of this, but just compare in your own mind the kinds of college catalogs that were extant 15 years ago to what they are now. It is simply the continuing specialization of the intellect. Before I press on, those of you who are really good, I bet you already jumped the gun and considered that from a more manifold view, specialization and what I'm about to point out, the complexization is actually quite operationally compatible. Although if we did not twist in a certain kind of non-sequential way the idea, then an ordinary mind would immediately think that the ideas of something becoming more complex, such as is a quite valid functional description of life's growth, is that it becomes more and more complex. Not in any qualitative sense, not in the sense of people saying life is too complex for me. It is simply that life is more complex. There is more to life. It is manifold. It continues to blossom. And the ordinary mind could say, well, if I'm going to drag in ideas of simplistic, which I'm about to, that they are in some way, at least within the general area of being anonymous, that they cannot be compatible, but they are. Of course, I'll grant you, not at any ordinary street level sequential view, they could not be. But as science, for instance, seems to grow more specialized and becomes more and more compartmentalized in a way that the ordinary mind could not comprehend, what would seem to be at first blush the opposite is also running at a parallel track, on a parallel track at a parallel pace. Work itself, what people do in life, their activities, work itself seems to become more and more a matter of segmentation, particularization, that no longer can you go apply for a job or fill out an application for a job and it have much meaning to say, well, I am interested in the world of physics. I am interested in construction work. Life itself, all the way from what would appear to be the most common physical, such as construction work, you cannot just now drive up. You might be able to find the guy named Buford, just a straw boss there on the job, but just to say, I do construction work. Just because you look down, the guy's got on work boots, it looks like you might be physically able to stand up to 8 hours worth of labor. You're a bricklayer, you're a mud boy, and you get into the more specific intellectual areas, and it is more and more in your lifetime, there's no doubt about this, it is just simply more and more a matter of compartmentalization as to what people do. And it would appear to be a form of increasing complexity, while at the same time that it's making life more complex, but then at what you could call an individual level, it seems to make things become more and more specific, become thing specific. You can't just say, well, if somebody asks, what do you do? Or if you are applying for a job and you say, well, I work on computers. That doesn't tell anybody anything. Not nowadays, not if you know anything about the field. Or if you just said, I'm in physics. I teach chemistry. You couldn't even get a job. They don't know how to file it away to say, well, the man teaches physics. It doesn't tell you anything anymore. Well, unless, of course, we're talking about a very crude level, as you know, if we're just talking about undergraduate work. But insofar as there being some meaningful, specific interest that a man's pursuing in life, even in the world of academia, It is more and more a matter of specialization, which is, I repeat, a matter of it becoming more complex, while from one view it appears to almost become more simplistic. Because nowadays, although you'd have to go through a certain kind of doctoral program to get a degree in physics, you end up, in a sense, if you follow this, it doesn't necessarily have to be educationally true, but you could end up having more and more knowledge, which I think was an old joke somewhere in your lifetime, of what a specialist is, of knowing more and more about less and less. That you could be nice, that you could have a PhD in physics, but it's possible, let us say, that you might not know as much about general physics, or you couldn't remember as much after it's all over, as someone who might be teaching Physics 101, or might be even teaching high school physics in a good high school, if there is such a thing. That the specialization is not incompatible with the complexities that is manifest in life growing. And it's a good thing we're not betting people, isn't it? Or I'd bet that all of you, that we may have even surpassed ourselves. I just have the impression that even, what, now 3 minutes, that everyone's lost. How about this then? Remember what we're talking about is that as life becomes more complex, the individual is running along a kind of parallel course that is not normally named. Or if it is, it's done in a qualitative, judgmental, subjective manner, such as people out there, the strays of life, hollering life is getting too complex. You know, give me the simple life. You know, which is always interesting. People be in the middle of Manhattan or Los Angeles, hollering, I cannot stand the complexity, the coldness, the overwhelming sophistication, in the true sense of the word, of modern life. Give me the simple life. All of you do understand by now that there's no sarcasm. There is a reality that people cannot see. If somebody was truly desirous of following the simple life, they would not be standing in downtown Manhattan hollering, give me the simple life. New York State's a large area. There's a lot more to those of you who hadn't been around to New York State than just Manhattan. Even the 5 major boroughs. There are places that you can go get lost. But notice, things are wired up so that strays do not get that far away from the general corral. That's why you find the rebels out in the streets, hauling down with the establishment, except they're just 2 blocks away from the university, the state-run university. At any rate. So you have simultaneously what amounts to the complexity of life increasing as it grows, while it apparently, while men are running on this parallel track, it can appear to be a matter almost of the other end of it, of complexity, which it is not. But I was going to give you one more example, being spurred on by the great success we've had with the first 2. How about what was once considered quite simple matters of human and family relationships are now seen as being zeniths of obscurity and complexity. I mean, what keeps talk radio, half the television shows and movies? Whereas your grandfather, not that it's right or wrong, you just got to understand life is more complex now, it is growing. But if we took your grandfather and you talked to them about human relationships, or if your grandfather or grandmother was still alive, if you had them alive and you set them down, or your great-grandmother, some of you younger ones, or great-great-grandparents, set them down and let them watch a typical television talk show of any kind. And most of them now are having to do with human relationships because there's only so many authors and sports figures, and so it's down to everyday people. Which plus they don't have to put them up in fancy hotels. They just show up and will, spill their guts and complain, yes, my wife slept with two of the major league teams in the American League. These people show up free. They'll pay their own way. They'll get on a bus and come to New York or Chicago to be on the show. At any rate, if you had, now we're not speaking about people, you understand. We're talking about the genetic extensions of life, and is represented by you at the ordinary level and your grandparents. We had your great-great-grandfather, and he listened to this. He just found it ridiculous. Not that it's right or wrong, but he just found it ridiculous to be discussing the complexities. That here it is, a national syndicated or a network television show spends an hour with an interviewer and a discussion about how you should treat your family, how you should treat your children, or if you're children, how you should treat your parents. If you're in love, if you're married to someone, how you should treat your wife. And now it's down to the point they've run out of, I assume, but now they can't make it interesting about today's guests are going to be 3 men or 3 women who cheated on their mate. Now that's years behind. It's going to have to be now. Our guest today is a panel of people who have cheated with their mate, and all 3 of them claim that part of their affairs were carried on with people from other planets. I mean, it has to go on and on. And if your grandfather heard this, you know, of course, forget the silliness. If it just gets down to the level, and they always have a few guests, and they have a psychiatrist or a psychologist that periodically begins to inject academic, scientific, professional views as to what's going on between, they've got a child sitting over here, a 30-year-old woman, and she's still bitching about the way her mother treated her. Her mother's sitting over here. And if your grandfather saw this, not that it's right or wrong, but you do understand, those of you are already laughing because your grandfather's down your own genes, that you've got to go out in public and discuss how you treat your children. I mean, it's like hearing something from another planet. Of course, that won't do anymore. That's why your grandfather always has to die, so that you can come along. And then you finally got to die so that your grandchildren can come along. And if you're ordinary, to hear your best statements of how life is, you representing your generation, that level of DNA expansion, and they've got to hear you make a statement, and they think, Jesus, this is a good thing that good old fart and that old fart's dying, you know. We got to make room for some sanity in life. You have humans at the individual level becoming more complex while becoming more specialized, and it is manifested out there, the world of academia, the world of politics, everything. All you got to do is listen to your own grandparents and your own DNA, because some of you are old enough now in your own genes that they're already. Of course, you should bite your tongue and go hide your head, but some of you are already, your own nervous system. Some of you who are only, I don't hate to say it, I was going to say maybe 20 or 30, but I'm not even going to say it because some of you might feel bad, so I won't say that. But some of you already have your own genes crying out about, God almighty, turn around and see teenagers now. The way they're dressed, the way they act. Some of your own genes, as they're supposed to, are already thinking, well, boy, I was wild enough in the 60s or the 70s. You know, I did some weird things, I'll admit it. But this is too much. It is what amounts to simultaneous evolutionary time zones living side by side. It's not a matter from any finite view of one being better than the other. There is a greater view, as all of you should know, that whatever the more complex is the better view, because that is, at the very least today, and it's probably portending, well, probably pointing to tomorrow. Strike portend, since it does have a real definition. But it is a simultaneous living, and it's all necessary in the same way that we can talk about, we did in the past, the 3 forces of there being at any particular time what appears to be a constructive force, and it is simultaneously, it must be if it's observable, if it is extant and active in this life, that it also has its own dancing partner that's resisting. At very best is dancing backwards and probably resisting. And there's also a third area. It's the band there in the ballroom. It's everyone who's not dancing. The E-force. They're the same as the 3 dimensions, as they're normally called. But there's going on simultaneously this, which seems to be going in one direction and something seems to be resisting it. And from one view, what I want you to see is there is without any doubt, the valid description is saying things are becoming more and more complex. Now, many people will say that in their own way out in the city, but they will use it with a certain pejorative tone, like, yeah, things are becoming more complex, life's getting out of hand. But in the same way, at a more of an individual level, things are becoming more simplistic. That is, it is becoming more and more a matter of specialization. That things become more and more compartmentalized. That what I was saying is, science, you can obviously see that. Education, you can see it. In the workforce, you can see it. Because many of you are old enough to know that the job you had maybe 10 years ago, now that one job, what you were doing is now probably cut up in an office somewhere into maybe 2 or 3 people. And your job has now been subclassified. And it is both, in the 3D world, it doesn't matter, but I just want you to see this because we're talking about the expansion of the nervous system really, but out there, apparently your job, if your job was listed as, office boy, nowadays office boy would be divided up, I'm sure, into at least 2 or 3 or 4 subdivisions. And it would be basically the same job you were doing 10 years ago. So you can say, well, it's more complex because now it takes 4 people to do what I used to be doing, what I was originally hired to do. So it's more complex. But then you can say in another way, in a 3D world, that as far as the individuals are concerned, is now more simplistic because if it's 4 people, then guy A, who's now doing 1/4 of what you did 10 years ago, you could say, it's not right or wrong, and it's not even true or false. It's just a 3-dimensional measurement. The guy A is now doing only 1/4 of the work you used to have to do. So you can say it is more simplistic. It is both. It is the simultaneous reality of different evolutionary time zones. Now, you could note, if you were neurally adventurous enough, you could note that you increasingly live in a kind of, we're surrounded by it, but a kind of secondary history that is being spoken about. By secondary history, I mean an instant history. But as soon as it happens, verbally, a priori, people immediately call it history. And I don't mean it in an academic sense. It is what would appear to be the 3rd dimension, one of the 3 dimensions in time of the past. That history is happening now immediately. Secondary history, not primary history, because there is no regular primary history unless you study dirt. And don't tell me that archaeologists study dirt. They pick it up, but then they talk about it. Well, as that famous doctor said, they just immediately screw it up. Because it's fine to study dirt until you talk about it. Think about it later. The secondary history of man is its own particular thing, and it is not archaeology. Because archaeology is a talking science. The only science would be a true science in that view. Any of you who went down that side road, and now that I started this, evidently none of you did. But a primary history nobody would know about because nobody ever talked about it. So don't say that archaeology or paleontology is the kind of science I'm talking about, because it's not. There is no such thing as a primary science. There's no such thing as a primary history. Oh, there is, but you can't talk about it. I knew you knew that. All right. The secondary history of man amounts to this, that it is continually spoken about. And that's the operational term here. It is continually spoken about. That is what history is. But it is spoken about in more and more, in smaller and smaller, and in increasingly personal terms. You got to listen fast. I like that trick. I don't know what you do to say you got to listen fast. Because some of this is so that the faster the better. We're talking about history now, secondary history, as what you are living in. Because it's now more and more a matter of speed. It's not a matter of power. Because the primary day of you being big and strong doesn't amount to spit. You can be as big and strong as you want to nowadays. And you may be able to go down to a redneck bar. That's not a bad idea. Well, you might be able to go down to a redneck bar and kick ass. And you might be able to pick up the waitress if you can stay sober enough, long enough till she gets off. But all of you simply understand this. The days of, this, that's about all it's good for us, Try to enter a contest or some crap. Or go out to the beach and casually, do this while you flex your body. But insofar as this is important nowadays, you can't even hardly make a living at that. We're talking about grunt wages just to, use your back. Everybody knows that. It's a matter of speed. Not a matter of strength anymore, which is simply the evolution of the human nervous system. But this also manifests itself in a way that is not normally noted. It's not supposed to be. But it is that the secondary history, that is, it's current events almost, but it actually becomes history because as soon as you say, You know, I don't like the way the economy is going. I mean, I saw the figures about the fourth quarter of the GNP. The government just released it 2 hours ago, and I got my copy, so it's only 2 hours. But you understand, it's history. If you only had it 5 minutes ago, and you read it, and you stood there, and you turned around to somebody in the office, and you said, Frank, do you have any idea what this could signify? It's history. It's secondary history. It is spoken of increasingly in smaller and smaller pieces. And it is, which is a version of how we start out tonight about the specialization, but it's also spoken of and thought of more and more in personalized terms. Did I already warn you this gets tricky and would talk fast? Yes. All right. I'll give you an example. And if anybody by any chance is looking at this tape, some ordinary, sane, educated person, if you had any doubt of what's going on, you might as well leave now and go get a milkshake. But there's some great external events going on. They're so obvious that when I bring them up, that any ordinary, sane person watching it will probably leave of their own volition. Now remember what we're talking about. The simultaneous running of life becoming more complex and life becoming more specialized, which from just quite ordinary, sane views have to be, at the very least, opposites. Do we have to be talking about some sort of ordinary dichotomy of things either going this way or that way, which is not, because it meets here, because this is where the idea of here and there came from. Consider amidst the, right now, the reverberating collapse, to use history circa 1991, late in the year, the last quarter, I guess, the far-reaching, reverberating effect of the collapse of, in your lifetime, what was called the East-West conflict. It's gone. Almost happened overnight. Consider also, you could say in line with that, doesn't really matter, but the major breakups of the nationalistic boundaries that have been extant, been in force since most of you have been alive. The states, the nations set up after WW2 of Czechoslovakia and all the Balkan areas around the Adriatic. All those, they're breaking up as we stand here. Would seem to be very important, dramatic, far-reaching historical events, secondary history happening as we stand here. Nations, institutions, religions, but I'm just using what seemed to be pretty obvious because right now there's just some of the territories that were held together by nationalistic boundaries for 40 or 50 years are just collapsing almost overnight, just falling to pieces. As much as it is written about, as much as it is part of the news media, and there's no doubt that they're using the large terms, that the ordinary life now, ordinary, the media, that is ordinary consciousness, ordinary minds are looking at on the basis that they're whole, indigenous, nationalistic, or racial areas, you know, part of the Slavs got pushed over just due to kind of post-war gerrymandering to where some of the Slavs were pushed over into areas of Albania where that they don't belong, or parts of Georgia were taken in by parts of what came to be artificially known as Romania. How the Azerbaijans still have enclaves over in Armenia, and they're saying they don't belong here. As strong, as specific, and as meaningful as that appears to be out there to history and to ordinary people. And they talk about it on that level. Can you see right quickly on another level that there is going on simultaneously beyond the ordinary level of perception, not just historical perspective of these large numbers of people coming into newly devised conflicts are not the USSR, the largest landmass nation in the world, falling apart before our very historical eyes. Although that certainly makes the news, can you see inside of all of that there is a smaller basis, that there is an increasing interest, though it's still not spoken of in such a way as to be noticeable to ordinary consciousness, but inside of all that is more and more a specialization of man's interest, so that even amidst what would seem to be, from some quite valid ordinary views, major breakups and shifts and alterations of human history, there is increasingly amidst that a specialization that turns history more and more into talk show gossip. That more and more, although they report that now Yugoslavia is falling apart before our very eyes because of the millions of Croatians over here and the millions of the Serbs over here and the millions of whoever's left over, the erstwhile Macedonians, and don't say anything about nuts, that here they are fighting these millions of people. Inside of that, can you see? Now I use talk show gossip because, as you know by now, it's always easy to think, hey, look over there. There's something people never thought about, especially if at first it sounds as though it might be accusatory, if not pejorative. Like, ooh, look at that. So we'll start. That's why I use talk show gossip. The current events, what amounts to the secondary history of man, is more and more on the basis of it not just being these large complex issues, but it's more and more on the basis of talk show gossip. That is, as opposed to the complexity of, oh my God, world events. Why in the world? How can we explain the fact? I mean, I didn't finish college, or I didn't major in history. How is it? How much do I have to read? I'm interested. Some of my parents, I'm speaking for an ordinary person now, some of my relatives came from that area. How is it that I can understand? I try to read time at least every week. How is it that I could understand the breakup, or the threatened breakup, by the way, of Czechoslovakia? That they are internally, it's not making the news as much as Yugoslavia, but the Czechs and the Slavs, I mean, they have lived there, whether they were indigenous neighbors or of the same so-called genetic strain to begin with. They have, since World War II, they have lived in relative peace. And I had relatives that came from that area. How could I understand this? There seems to be that interest, but as opposed to that going on, what I'm inferring to you about talk show gossip, and that's just this crude pointing out there of a partial example, when the example is in the nervous system expansion of man, of it becoming not only more complex, but becoming coevally more specialized, is this: that rather than there being a widespread, and this has nothing to do with education, that's not it. If we were ordinary, we'd say, oh yeah, it does, but it does not, comma. The discussions more and more are not on the disintegration, for instance, of the USSR, or the threatened falling apart of the nationalistic boundaries of Czechoslovakia. Notice the interest is more and more on the personalities of a Yeltsin or a Havel. It's not right or wrong, it's always been going on. You can find it in Homer, in his writings. That you could take a real crude view if you were not following this, which of course I'd be shocked if anyone was having any difficulty. You could look back 3,000 years ago and say, wait a minute, history has always been partly gossip. I understand that. It's true. But can you, and we can quit this pointing, especially since we're running out of time, and look in you, because your own nervous system at street level, at city level, reflects what's going on. There is more and more, and it's not right or wrong. It has nothing to do with saying, well, the whole world is becoming diseducated. And young people today are not interested in history. They don't want to go out and read Durant or Toynbee. They want to read People magazine. They're not interested in history. Shame on these children. They just want to read gossip. It is more and more, look to your own nervous system. Your own nervous system at that level is reacting in reverberating at the same kind of frequency as life itself, that it is the truth, not right or wrong from any ordinary view, but it is true that there, because this has to do, I'm going to use history and then what seems to be personalities, but we're talking about the simultaneous, the impossible from a 3D view, but the simultaneous increasing complexity of life, while at the same time it is an increasing specialization, which from any ordinary sequential view, God save us from the sequences, is impossible. But the human nervous system now reacts more and more to wanting to hear gossip about Boris Yeltsin than it does about the political ramifications, the questions involved if indeed the apparent, the potential disintegration of the various republics of the USSR continues apace, or what may be happening to Czechoslovakia amongst those two people. Less and less interest in that, and the fact that Havel claims that one of his high artistic idols were the Rolling Stones. And the guy is the president of a country. This has nothing to do with an attack on Havel, People magazine, the Rolling Stones. It is a matter of increasing specialization. It is a matter of increasing personalization of what seems to be history. It is nothing new, but it is increased, and me calling it the personalization of history, me bringing out that people on the street now don't take on the street as being a slam. The majority of civilized minds, that's what I mean by on the street, now have, civilized, educated minds now have uncontrollably more interest in knowing personally about Havel than they do about the political background, the possible ramifications, if indeed Czechoslovakia does disintegrate. There's much to be said. There are many ramifications that could eventually affect your pocketbook. You know, it could create some kind of conflict, and they might have to send off your second cousin over there, you know, to serve with some kind of UN forces. It could certainly affect you. But notice your own nervous system nowadays, and you might say, well, I keep up with history. I'm interested to know what's going on with the various republics in the USSR and now voting to go their own way, and what the kind of tensions this is going to create with the erstwhile Communist Party. But notice your own nervous system, it'll say, Boris Yeltsin, again today, apparently had been drinking. That, and I always pick on that, you know, get somebody's attention. The drinking's got nothing to do with it. It is the specialization. It is the humanization. It is, as life becomes more and more complex, in the midst of all of that, the individual seems to be of more and more interest. It is the increasing complexity, which is the only way anything grows in this finite system in which we live. But now it has reached a point that as it goes complex, it internally, in a sense, shrinks. It is a Mobius strip swallowing its own tail. And don't anybody try to say, wait a minute, that's what a Mobius strip wants to do anyway. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. We're out of time. So we're out of time.